January 22nd, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Tyrrhenian Sea, casting a cold, metallic glow on the churning waters off Anzio. The air smells of oil, salt, and cordite. Landing craft grind against the sand, ramps crashing down into surf streaked with smoke. Amid the roar of naval guns, a new sound cuts through. The hurried splash of boots and the clatter of medical stretchers. But these aren't infantrymen charging with rifles. They are women, U.S. Army nurses, wading through waist-deep water, their olive-drab uniforms soaked and heavy. Helmets sit awkwardly on heads trained for hospitals, not beaches under fire. On shore, chaos reigns. The wounded lie in the sand, calling for morphine or God. German shells scream overhead, detonating among the dunes. Axis officers watching from inland outposts stare in disbelief. American nurses landing under fire? A nurse kneels beside a dying soldier, her hands trembling only for a moment before steadying on the wound. The war had found them, and they had come to meet it. But to understand how these women ended up on this burning shore, we must go back to the long road that led them here. The Italian campaign had begun with promise and peril. By late 1943, the Allied armies had driven Axis forces from North Africa and Sicily. Yet as they pushed north into mainland Italy, the war slowed to a crawl. The Germans, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, transformed the rugged Italian terrain into a fortress. The Gustav Line, a chain of defensive positions stretching across the Italian peninsula, stopped the Allies cold. Winter brought rain, mud, and death. The mountains above Monte Cassino became killing grounds, where every ridge was fought for at the cost of hundreds of lives. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, knew that a frontal assault would bleed his men white. Winston Churchill demanded something bold, a move to break the stalemate. His idea: a seaborne landing far behind the German lines. Strike at the underbelly of Europe, outflank Kesselring, and open the road to Rome. The operation was codenamed Shingle. Its target: the quiet coastal town of Anzio, 35 miles south of Rome. In theory, it was simple. Land 2 divisions of the U.S. Fifth Army under Major General John P. Lucas on the beaches. Seize the surrounding high ground before German reinforcements could arrive. Then push inland, forcing the enemy to abandon the Gustav Line. But wars are rarely kind to theories. The plan demanded speed and surprise. Yet political pressure, limited resources, and confusion between British and American command meant that Lucas's landing force was smaller than ideal, about 36,000 men, with 2,300 vehicles and 90 tanks. Among them, hidden in the logistics manifests and medical orders, was a new kind of unit: the 33rd Field Hospital and elements of the 95th Evacuation Hospital, staffed by U.S. Army nurses trained for combat medicine. They were to land soon after the initial wave, setting up mobile treatment tents just behind the front lines. Their mission was simple, but perilous: to save lives faster than the enemy could take them. By January 1944, these nurses had already seen war from behind the lines, in North Africa, in Sicily, in the dust and blood of mobile hospitals where morphine was as precious as gold. They had learned to triage amid chaos, to amputate under canvas roofs, to watch men die and keep working. Yet Anzio would be different. Here, the front and the rear would be one and the same. The Allies expected a quick victory, perhaps a few days before the breakout toward Rome. Few believed the beachhead itself would become a battlefield. But the nurses' superiors quietly prepared them for the worst. They packed extra dressings, plasma bottles, and morphine. They studied field evacuation routes and casualty projections. As the landing fleet assembled in Naples, rumors spread among the troops. Some grumbled that sending women this close to combat was reckless. Others took comfort in their presence. a reminder of home amid the machinery of death. In the early hours of January 22nd, the operation began. British and American ships steamed through the night toward Anzio. Offshore, the moonlight flickered across a sea thick with landing craft and destroyers. Naval gunfire pounded the coast, though resistance seemed light. By dawn, infantry of the U.S. 3rd Division and the British 1st Division were ashore, advancing inland with little opposition. Behind them, supply and support units began unloading. Tanks, ammunition, medical gear, and, quietly, the hospital detachments. The nurses waited below decks, listening to the distant thud of artillery and the cries of wounded being brought aboard. When their turn came, they descended the ramps into cold water, arms full of bandages and hope. Axis commanders at first thought it a bluff. Women in uniform on the beach? It seemed impossible. But reconnaissance photos and intercepted radio chatter confirmed it. For the first time in modern history, American women had landed on an active battlefield under enemy fire. And though they carried no weapons, their courage would soon be tested like any soldiers. Before Anzio, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps was a force built on quiet endurance. By 1943, more than 50,000 women had volunteered to serve. They came from hospitals, farms, and universities, trading white aprons for olive drab. Few had imagined themselves on battlefields, yet the demands of a global war left little choice. Training for combat medicine was brutal. At military camps across America, Fort Oglethorpe, Camp Polk, and Camp Rucker, women learned to march, pitch tents, fire sidearms, and navigate the logistics of treating men in chaos. They drilled under simulated bombings, practiced emergency amputations on mannequins, and memorized the procedures for shock, hemorrhage, and infection. Still, no training could truly prepare them for what was coming. When they shipped to North Africa in 1942 and Sicily in 1943, the nurses discovered that battlefields were nothing like hospitals. Medical tents shook under nearby explosions. Blood covered the floors before the first hour of fighting was over. But they learned. They adapted. They operated without rest for days, turning open ground into triage zones that kept divisions alive. Their resilience caught the attention of Allied command and, ultimately, of General Mark Clark's U.S. Fifth Army, which was planning the Anzio landing. The logic was pragmatic. If the invasion succeeded, the beachhead would quickly fill with thousands of wounded. The closer the nurses were to the front, the faster soldiers could be saved. Medical officers argued that having trained surgical staff within a few miles of combat could cut mortality rates dramatically. Yet this decision defied tradition. Women had always served in war, but rarely so close to the guns. At the time, U.S. regulations still barred female personnel from direct exposure to combat zones. The idea of women landing under fire was unthinkable, both to the army, bureaucracy, and to the Axis powers. German intelligence reports during early 1944 noted that female auxiliary personnel were attached to Allied units in Italy, but commanders dismissed them as rear-echelon support. Even propaganda ministries scoffed at the notion that Americans would risk sending women into harm's way. Then came the morning of January 22, 1944. From the first landing waves, Anzio defied expectation. The beaches were quiet, the sky clear. Nurses and medics established temporary aid stations near the shoreline. Patients arrived faster than expected. Shrapnel wounds, burns, fractures from vehicle accidents in the sand. For a brief moment, it seemed Operation Shingle might unfold without disaster. The nurses worked methodically, almost clinically, as if the ocean itself had become an operating theater. They set up field cots under tarps, mixed plasma bottles, recorded blood types. In those first hours, they saved dozens who would have otherwise died before reaching a hospital ship. Axis officers observing from distant hills began to notice the strange presence of unarmed figures tending the fallen. Through binoculars, German spotters reported women in uniform among the Americans. Command posts were stunned. The concept of female personnel landing, alongside combat troops, contradicted every military convention of the time. But soon, the disbelief would give way to calculation. If the Americans were placing their medical staff on the beaches, then they clearly believed Anzio to be safe, a vulnerable assumption. Kesselring and his commanders began to plan their counterattack. Meanwhile, the nurses continued their quiet routine. By nightfall, tents of the 33rd Field Hospital flickered with lantern light, the sea wind rustling the canvas like a heartbeat. They wrote letters home in the few silent minutes between shifts. One nurse wrote simply, "We are here and it feels strange to be this close. But someone has to be." In the days that followed, supply convoys brought more medical units ashore. Field laboratories, operating tables, sterilizers. The nurses worked in relays, establishing the lifeline that would sustain thousands of men. They did not yet know that within days, these makeshift hospitals would become the most dangerous place on Earth. Anzio was about to erupt. The Germans were regrouping. The Allies had paused their advance, and the women who had crossed the surf would soon find themselves trapped on a beachhead under siege. Their courage would soon be tested from every possible angle: human, tactical, and moral. The human angle, courage under firewar, strips away illusions quickly. For the nurses of Anzio, the transformation came not with ceremony, but with the shriek of artillery shells. Within days of the landing, German reconnaissance confirmed the presence of Allied medical units near the shoreline. The retaliation began swiftly and without mercy. The bombardment fell like rain. Mortar shells exploded along the beaches, shattering supply trucks and collapsing tents. Medical units, clearly marked with red crosses, became targets of circumstance, caught in the same grid of destruction as infantry and armor. The nurses ducked and worked, the line between caregiver and combatant dissolving with every impact. First Lieutenant Marian Elcano remembered holding a transfusion bottle as dirt rained down around her. The patient never flinched, and neither did she. "We were scared," she wrote later, "but the work didn't stop. You learned to tell by sound how close it was. There was no glamour, no speeches, only discipline and instinct." Some prayed between explosions, others hummed to steady their hands. Fear existed, but duty was louder. Within weeks, these women performed more surgeries and amputations than most doctors did in a lifetime. They worked 16-hour days, slept on stretchers beside the wounded, and rationed morphine when supplies ran thin. Every life saved became a small defiance against the violence pressing in from all sides. To the soldiers, they were angels in helmets. To the enemy, an enigma. To themselves, they were simply doing the job they had sworn to do. The tactical angle, medicine as strategy in military terms, Anzio was a logistical nightmare. The beachhead stretched just 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep. A pocket of mud hemmed in by the sea on one side and the Alban Hills on the other. The Germans controlled the high ground. They could see everything. For the Allies, keeping men alive within that deadly bowl became an act of strategy as much as compassion. Every wounded soldier saved meant one less casualty on the roster, one more rifle to return to the line when recovered. The nurses were essential to that equation. Evacuation routes were constantly threatened, convoys shelled, ambulances destroyed. The 33rd Field Hospital operated within range of German artillery, yet it remained functional almost every day of the siege. This proximity allowed surgeons and nurses to treat casualties within minutes of injury, a radical shift from earlier campaigns where delays killed thousands. They developed improvisations under pressure. When supply lines were cut, they sterilized instruments with makeshift boilers. When power failed, operations continued by flashlight or moonlight reflected off tin basins. Each act of adaptation became a victory of logic over chaos. Allied commanders noted that the mortality rate among Anzio's wounded fell dramatically despite the shelling. The reason was clear: proximity medicine. The nurses weren't behind the war. They were inside it, reducing the time between injury and treatment to mere minutes. It was an unintended but revolutionary tactical advantage, and one that foreshadowed the future of combat medicine. Still, this advantage came at a cost. The Germans soon realized that crippling the Allied medical structure could paralyze morale. By February, hospital areas were receiving concentrated bombardments. Medics and nurses began digging slit trenches beside operating tables, treating the wounded between barrages. Medicine and warfare had fused into one terrible continuum. The leadership angle. Decisions in doubt. At the top of the chain of command, leadership was faltering. Major General John P. Lucas, commander of the Sixth Corps, had achieved surprise at Anzio. Yet instead of striking inland, he hesitated. Orders from higher command were vague. Hold until reinforcements arrived. The pause allowed Kesselring to regroup and bring in panzer divisions from across Italy. The beachhead soon became a trap. As German artillery zeroed in, Allied troops dug in, turning medical units into semi-permanent installations within the front line. The nurses' superiors, including the chief medical officer, Colonel James Rogers, requested permission to relocate the hospitals farther from the guns. The answer came back: hold your positions. The wounded cannot be moved safely, and so they held. Leaders made choices that weighed lives like equations. To the generals, maintaining a forward medical presence was necessary for operational readiness. To the nurses, it meant surviving another night beneath the barrage, working by the flicker of lanterns while shells thundered beyond the tent walls. Many officers questioned the morality of keeping women within such proximity to danger. Some argued for immediate evacuation. Others countered that removing them would cripple morale. Soldiers fought harder knowing those women were there, not as symbols, but as saviors. One company commander later recalled, "You could see men cling to life just to make it to the nurses. They believed if they reached that tent, they'd live." For leadership, Anzio was a dilemma. For the nurses, it was no longer a choice. The decisions made above them had placed them squarely in the crucible of modern warfare. The technological angle: innovation. Born in the fire, the nurses at Anzio were not only healers, they were pioneers standing at the edge of medical transformation. The front demanded improvisation, and from that necessity came invention. Field medicine had evolved since North Africa, but Anzio accelerated its progress by sheer desperation. With evacuation routes constantly bombed and supply convoys delayed, the hospitals had to operate like autonomous systems, self-contained, mobile, and efficient. Surgical teams developed rapid triage methods that prioritized survival probabilities with ruthless clarity. They adapted battlefield plasma transfusions using improvised tubing when stockpiles ran dry. Nurses, often trained in civilian hospitals, learned to sterilize instruments with gasoline burners, to reuse surgical gloves after boiling, and to fashion splints from ammunition crates. Electricity was unreliable, so operations took place under lanterns, headlights, or even flares dropped by passing aircraft. It was here that the concept of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, later immortalized in Korea, found its earliest form. Anzio's nurses, working alongside surgeons and orderlies, helped establish the protocols that would define forward area surgery for decades. One recorded innovation was the use of shock teams, nurses, and doctors who moved directly to frontline aid posts with portable supplies of plasma and morphine. The idea was radical: bring the hospital to the wounded, rather than the wounded to the hospital. Technology was not measured in machines at Anzio. It was measured in moments saved, in wounds stabilized, in breaths restored beneath the scream of shells. Every tent, every instrument, became part of an evolving science of survival. The enemy angle. The Axis reaction when reports reached German command that American nurses were operating within the Anzio perimeter, disbelief turned to fascination, and, in some corners, respect Axis field officers, particularly those in observation posts overlooking the beaches, began noting patterns. Even under heavy bombardment, the medical tents stayed active. Women moved between cots and stretchers as calmly as soldiers manning guns. Captured German diaries later revealed astonishment. One soldier wrote, "They bring their women into hell and still they do not break. Either they are mad or they are stronger than we thought." Propaganda leaflets dropped by the Germans mocked the presence of American Ladies of Mercy, suggesting that Allied morale was crumbling if women were needed so near the front. Yet, paradoxically, such mockery betrayed a measure of unease. For all their derision, Axis troops were witnessing something new, a kind of courage that defied the expectations of gender and war. At times, that respect turned to restraint. Eyewitness accounts from prisoners of war claimed that German artillery avoided deliberate targeting of hospitals once Red Cross markers were re-established, though such mercy was never guaranteed. Anzio was chaos, and shells fell where they may. Still, the psychological impact was profound. Axis officers reportedly used the nurses' presence as proof to their men that the Allies were deeply committed, that they would risk everything, even their women, for victory. The sight of nurses working under fire did not just tend to Allied wounded. It rattled the enemy's understanding of what kind of force they were facing. The moral angle. War and humanity. The nurses of Anzio lived within a moral paradox. They were healers inside a machine built for destruction. Their presence blurred the line between compassion and duty, between humanity and war. Many questioned whether it was ethical to send women into such horror. But those who served had no illusions about heroism. They volunteered knowing the cost. They treated the wounded without question, American, British, even captured German soldiers. In those tents, nationality dissolved into anatomy. A wound was a wound. Pain had no side. One nurse recalled performing emergency care on a young German conscript. When the man opened his eyes and realized his savior was American, he wept. She wrote in her diary, "In that moment, there was no enemy, just a boy too young to die." These moments of fragile humanity stood in stark contrast to the brutality surrounding them. Outside the tents, tanks burned and men screamed for medics. Inside, silence and focus reigned. The moral weight of that work left scars that no medal could heal. Many nurses carried the memory of Anzio for the rest of their lives, not as triumph, but as testament. They had seen what war did to the body, and what mercy could still do to the soul. Ethicists and historians later debated whether their deployment was justified. Some argued that no level of bravery excused the risk. Others countered that their presence saved thousands of lives and changed military medicine forever. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between, in the quiet dignity of those who refused to retreat, even when everything around them told them to run. February 1944. Anzio. A beachhead turned into a cauldron. For 2 weeks, Allied command had waited for General Lucas to advance inland. Instead, he fortified. Trenches stretched across the marshy fields, barbed wire glinting in the thin winter sun. The delay gave Kesselring time to gather his forces. The German 14th Army, reinforced with panzer divisions and heavy artillery. When the counterattack came, it came like thunder. On February 16th, German guns opened up from the Alban Hills, unleashing one of the most sustained bombardments of the Italian campaign. Nearly 2,500 shells per hour rained down on the beachhead. The air shook, the ground convulsed. For the soldiers and medics trapped below, there was nowhere to run. The hospitals, marked with giant red crosses, were directly in the line of fire. Tents shredded under shrapnel. Ambulances burned. Men screamed for cover as explosions ripped through supply depots. Yet amid this hell, the nurses stayed. Lieutenant Mary Roberts, head nurse of the 33rd Field Hospital, was in surgery when the first salvo struck. The lights flickered, dust falling from the ceiling. Someone shouted, "Incoming!" But the scalpel never paused. She later recalled, there was no point in running. Where would we go? So we kept cutting, sewing, transfusing. The shells fell, and the work went on. Nurses crawled through debris to reach patients. Some were hit. First Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth, a Wisconsin nurse, refused to leave her post after shrapnel tore into her chest. She kept tending to the wounded until she collapsed. She would die days later. Posthumously awarded the Silver Star, the first nurse of the Italian campaign to receive it. Inside the surgical tents, chaos blurred into rhythm. The wounded arrived in waves, infantrymen pulled from foxholes, tank crews dragged from burning vehicles. The nurses worked until their hands blistered and their voices broke. Each new casualty became another battle between life and time. When the generators failed, they worked by candlelight. When shells cut water lines, they sterilized with what they could. When the air stank of cordite and blood, they wrapped scarves around their faces and carried on. Outside, the battle raged without pause. German Tiger tanks pressed toward the town of Anzio itself. British and American infantry counterattacked through flooded fields, ankle-deep in mud and shell casings. The beachhead had become a nightmare of smoke, noise, and fear. And yet, in the center of it all, the nurses remained a strange stillness, islands of calm amid the storm. The wounded clung to their presence. Soldiers who had lost limbs asked only if the girls were still there. When told yes, they smiled faintly, as if that alone meant they might live. One medic wrote in his diary, "The guns are louder than God tonight, but when you see them walking through the smoke, you start to believe again." The psychological power of their courage became a weapon of its own. At headquarters, debate raged. Commanders considered withdrawing medical personnel to ships offshore. But to move them now would mean abandoning thousands of wounded. And the nurses themselves refused to go. They sent word through their commanding officer, "We stay with the men." By the end of February, Anzio had endured nearly 400,000 artillery shells. Entire hospital complexes were reduced to mud and canvas fragments. Yet, the work continued. Under open skies, under bombardment, under the shadow of death itself. Even German prisoners captured during the assault later expressed astonishment. One SS officer reportedly told his interrogator, "We saw your women working while our guns fired. We could not believe it. They are braver than your generals." Those words, whether pride, shock, or bitter respect, captured the essence of that month. Because at Anzio, bravery was no longer measured in medals or rank. It was measured in the number of lives pulled back from oblivion by steady hands that refused to tremble. The counterattack eventually faltered. The Allies held, but the cost was immense. Thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, and a beachhead that looked more like a graveyard than a gateway to Rome. Still, for those nurses, retreat was never an option. Their mission was life, and life demanded presence, even when the sky itself seemed to fall. By early March 1944, Anzio had become a wound that refused to heal. The front no longer moved. It merely breathed in shallow, shuddering rhythms. Every day began and ended with artillery. Every night, the beachhead lit up with the orange pulse of distant bombardments. For the nurses, The rhythm of war had become almost physiological. They no longer startled at explosions. The human mind, they discovered, could normalize anything, even hell. They called the hospital sector Hell's Half-Acre. It was a place where mud mixed with blood and morphine. Canvas tents stood shredded by shrapnel, patched and repatched until the fabric was more whole than cloth. The nurses slept in foxholes beside their wards, helmets doubling as pillows, rifles nearby, though few of them ever touched one. At dawn, the low drone of Luftwaffe bombers signaled the beginning of another day. They would rise, brush dirt from their uniforms, and return to the operating tables, as if the world outside the canvas no longer existed. Rations were thin. Supplies were erratic. Infection rates soared, and yet the nurses maintained a discipline that astonished even battle-hardened officers. They worked in teams of 2 or 3, one scrubbing wounds, one recording vitals, one holding the flashlight steady during a power outage. When ammunition detonations shook the ground, they steadied their hands over open incisions. The statistics tell part of the story. Between January and May, the Anzio medical units treated over 30,000 casualties. Survival rates for the seriously wounded exceeded 90%. A T-30 figure that defied all expectations for a combat zone under siege. The nurses became the beating heart of that impossible statistic. One night, during a particularly brutal bombardment, a shell struck within meters of the 33rd Field Hospital. The blast tore a crater large enough to swallow a truck. Shrapnel shredded the side of a surgical tent, severing the main power line. For a few seconds, total darkness engulfed the area. Then, voices. Calm, quiet, organized. Nurses grabbed lanterns, relit stoves, stabilized oxygen tanks. The chief surgeon ordered operations to continue, and the team obeyed without hesitation. When daylight came, they discovered 2 unexploded shells buried in the earth just outside the tent. They left them there. There was no time to dig them out. That day, they performed 27 major surgeries. To the Germans on the ridges above, the spectacle was surreal. Through binoculars, they could see the movement of medical tents, the flicker of lights, the silhouettes of women working through the smoke. They had shelled the same area for weeks, and yet it never went silent. Prisoners later described the disbelief spreading through Axis ranks. Word circulated in the trenches that the Americans bring angels to war. Some officers dismissed it as myth. Others demanded confirmation. Observation posts verified it. Women in uniform moving calmly among the wounded under direct fire. One captured German radio operator was quoted saying, "We thought they were propaganda actors until we saw them carry a man out of a burning tent." For an army steeped in traditional notions of warfare, the sight shook their expectations. It wasn't just courage, it was defiance of logic. Women were not supposed to endure that kind of terror. Yet these did, and without a weapon in hand. By April, the nurses had become part of the mythos of Anzio. Correspondents who managed to reach the front wrote dispatches that astonished readers back home. They live beneath the same guns as the men they heal. They ask for nothing but gauze and light. But the public never knew the full cost. Behind the calm eyes and efficient motions, the toll was immense. Many suffered exhaustion, malnutrition, and trauma that would haunt them for life. Some collapsed from overwork and refused evacuation, insisting their beds be given to the wounded. One nurse later confessed in a letter, "You stop feeling fear. You stop feeling anything. Then one day, a soldier calls you ma'am and thanks you for saving him. And for a moment, you remember you're human again." As spring arrived, the siege finally began to ease. Reinforcements from the U.S. 1st Armored Division and British 5th Division broke through parts of the German line. Slowly, painfully, the pressure lifted. The shelling decreased, the skies cleared, and the wounded began to outnumber the fresh arrivals. The nurses, their uniforms faded to gray and their faces hollow from fatigue, kept working through it all, until at last, silence fell over the beach. For the first time in months, there was no sound of guns, only the distant rush of the sea. They stepped out of their tents, blinking into the sunlight, and for a brief moment, the war seemed to pause, as if even death itself was taking a breath. From the hills, abandoned Axis positions stared down at the beachhead that had refused to die. Among the few captured letters recovered later, one line stood out. "We fired at them for months, but they never ran." Even our officers said, "Those women have the hearts of iron." It was not meant as praise, but it became one. June 1944. The guns at Anzio finally fell silent. The battle that had begun as a gamble had cost nearly 70,000 Allied casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The once quiet fishing port was now a plain of wreckage and graves. Tanks lay rusting beside shattered ambulances. The beaches that had swarmed with life were littered with the remnants of war. Stretchers, shell casings, and crosses. But from that ruin, the road to Rome opened at last. The Allies broke through the German lines in late May. By June 4th, American armor rolled into the Eternal City. Crowds cheered, church bells rang, and photographers captured jubilant faces in the streets. Yet, for the nurses of Anzio, the triumph carried a quieter, heavier tone. They did not march in parades. They stayed behind, cleaning instruments, bandaging new arrivals, cataloging the names of those who would never return home. The liberation was victory, yes, but it was also the moment when the scale of their endurance became clear. The official commendations came weeks later. Dozens of nurses from the 33rd Field Hospital and 95th Evacuation Hospital received Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and, in rare cases, Silver Stars for valor under fire. These were not ceremonial awards. They were earned in blood. Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth's citation described her extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty under fire. It was a phrase repeated for others, who had chosen to remain when retreat was an option. The commanding officers wrote that without the nurses' presence, the casualty rate would have been catastrophically higher. Their forward area surgeries had saved thousands, not through technology or firepower, but through resolve. In the aftermath, the hospital staff were rotated out of the front lines. Some were sent to Naples, others to newly liberated towns further north. Their faces appeared in military newsletters, their names in dispatches, but most of their stories never reached the public. To the soldiers who survived, they were unforgettable. Many wrote letters to families back home describing the women who had pulled them through the dark. One infantryman from the 3rd Division wrote to his mother, "When I thought I was dying, she told me I wasn't. She was right. I never even got her name." Another survivor returned to Anzio years later, long after the war, and placed flowers near what had been the site of the 33rd Field Hospital. He said quietly to a reporter, "They were our shield when we had nothing else." The press back home published brief articles about the Angels of Anzio, but wartime censorship muted the full story. Military authorities feared that too much publicity about women in combat zones might alarm the public. Instead, the narrative became a symbol: courage with compassion, bravery in silence. Yet among those who had been there, the truth was more complex. The nurses weren't saints or symbols. They were soldiers in all but name, witnesses to the limits of endurance. Many never spoke of what they had seen. Some left the service unable to return to civilian life, haunted by the memories of men they could not save. But collectively, they had changed the U.S. Army forever. Their performance under fire dismantled the notion that women were unfit for proximity to combat. After Anzio, military planners rewrote their doctrines. Future operations in Europe, Korea, and Vietnam would include mobile hospitals staffed with women who followed the same model. Forward, fast, fearless. The Anzio nurses had proven that battlefield medicine could not wait behind the lines. It had to walk with the war itself. The war moved on. But for those who had lived through Anzio, it never truly ended. When the nurses returned home, many were greeted as heroes. Yet their stories rarely fit the headlines. They didn't speak of glory or patriotism. They spoke of blood that would not wash away, of hands that shook when silence fell, of the faces that came back in dreams. Psychological trauma was not yet understood as PTSD. It was called battle fatigue, or dismissed entirely. Few recognized that the nurses, too, had fought their own invisible war. Lieutenant Marion Elcano, who had worked through the bombardment, later wrote, "I didn't think about fear while it was happening. It came afterward, when it was quiet. That's when you remembered every sound, every scream, every man who didn't make it." Many returned to civilian hospitals, bringing with them skills honed under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They introduced techniques for trauma triage, shock management, and rapid sterilization that would transform emergency medicine. What they had learned in the mud of Anzio became the foundation of modern military and disaster response care. Yet they rarely received recognition as innovators. Their courage had been functional, necessary, not celebrated. In the decades that followed, historians began to re-examine the campaign. Military reports, once focused solely on strategy, started to include the human dimension, the psychological toll, and the medical heroism that sustained the front. Declassified records revealed the extent of the nurses' exposure to danger. At one point, more than 50% of the field medical staff were operating within artillery range, some less than 2 miles from enemy lines. What had once been seen as a wartime anomaly was, in truth, a turning point in military ethics. The presence of women under fire forced armies, both Allied and Axis, to confront a question that transcended tactics. If war spares no one, what then is bravery? In interviews years later, the nurses themselves spoke not of defiance, but of duty. They described themselves simply as professionals doing what was required. Yet the quiet conviction behind those words spoke volumes. Lieutenant Betty Evans, who served at Anzio and later in France, told a journalist in 1961, "I wasn't brave. I was just busy." You learned to work faster than the fear. But others remembered the disbelief of the enemy, how German officers, hardened by years of combat, had been stunned to see them walking through shell fire. That shock, more than anything, had marked a psychological victory. It reminded both sides that even in total war, there remained a human core that refused to yield to barbarity. By the time memorials were erected on the Anzio beaches, the nurses were older, gray-haired, some confined to wheelchairs. They stood silently as the sea wind moved across the ruins of the old port. One of them, a woman who had survived every bombardment without a scratch, placed a small medical pin into the sand. "For the ones who didn't go home," she said. Today, at the Anzio Beachhead Museum, among the uniforms and helmets, there is a small display, a blood-stained nurse's sleeve, a pair of worn combat boots, a faded photograph of a tent under shell fire. The caption reads, "U.S. Army Nurse Corps, January-June 1944. They landed under fire." Visitors often pause at that exhibit longer than at the tanks or rifles, perhaps because it represents something deeper than warfare. The insistence on life amid annihilation. The world that followed was different. After Anzio, women would serve on front lines across Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each generation carried forward the unspoken legacy of those who had first stepped onto the beaches of Italy, unarmed, unflinching, and unforgotten. Their story is not about victory or defeat. It is about endurance, the kind that does not end when the guns go quiet. The beaches of Anzio are quiet now. The wind that once carried the sound of artillery drifts gently across the dunes, stirring the tall grass where the hospitals once stood. The sea, forever indifferent, washes over the same sand that was stained with blood and courage. It is hard to imagine, standing there today, that this tranquil shoreline was once the center of so much chaos, a place where war and mercy existed side by side. The nurses who landed there did not come for glory. They came because the wounded were waiting, because someone had to hold the line between life and death. Not with rifles, but with hands, bandages, and compassion. In their defiance of fear, they revealed something elemental about humanity, that even in its darkest moments, war cannot extinguish empathy. That courage does not always wear a uniform of command or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears a red cross and walks through fire unarmed. Their presence forced the world to rethink what it meant to serve. They shattered assumptions of gender, of strength, of where the boundaries of duty end. In doing so, they changed not only the face of military medicine, but the moral vocabulary of warfare itself. When Axis officers wrote that they were stunned to see American nurses landing under fire, they were witnessing more than bravery. They were witnessing the quiet revolution of human decency enduring amid destruction. The proof that compassion can stand shoulder to shoulder with courage and not falter. History often remembers the soldiers, the generals, the victories, but in Anzio, amid the thunder and ruin, it was the healers who defined what victory truly meant, not the conquest of territory, but the preservation of humanity. And so, as the waves continued to erase the footprints of war, one truth remains etched in the silence: that on a cold Italian morning in 1944, when the world was tearing itself apart, a handful of women stepped onto the beach under fire and reminded mankind of what it was fighting to protect.